Good morning. I look forward to calling this subcommittee on trade meeting to order. We thank everybody for joining us today. We're holding this committee virtually in compliance with regulations for remote committee proceedings. So I'm going to go through the boilerplate for a moment. I want to remind members of a few procedures to help you navigate the virtual hearing. First, consistent with regulations, committee will keep microphones muted to limit background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Second, members and witnesses must have their cameras on at all times. If you need to step away from the proceedings, please leave your camera on rather than logging out. Third, we'll dispense with our practice of observing the Gibbons rule and instead go in order of seniority for questioning, alternating between members of majority and minority, beginning with Democratic members of the Trade Subcommittee. Finally, without objection, Representative Davis is authorized to serve as committee chair in my absence in the event I experience technical difficulties. And with that, I will turn to the critical topic of today's hearing. This is something I have been looking forward to for some time. We're holding a hearing on the subject that we all agree is of critical importance, our nation's infrastructure. For too long, we have not provided the federal investments needed to maintain and modernize our country's roads and bridges, ports and waterways, rail and transit systems, airports and broadband, water, energy infrastructure, and bike paths. We have made some incremental progress in improving our infrastructure in recent years, but decades of underinvestment are catching up with us. The funding gap between our infrastructure needs and the projects we have financed over the next 10 years has grown to $2.59 trillion. And the COVID-19 pandemic has made an already difficult situation, to be charitable, worse. Revenue streams generated by users of our roads and transit systems and airports have dried up. State governments have faced rising costs and budget shortfalls during the pandemic-induced economic downturn. It's going to require major investments to recover, let alone prepare us for a low-carbon future and meet the demands for equity and inclusion. The health and economic crisis has meant even less resources are available at the state and local level to meet the nation's infrastructure needs. The pandemic has highlighted the stark disparities that continue to exist across our country when it comes to the quality of our infrastructure and affordable access to it. As a result, many Americans are being left behind without sufficient access to health care and job opportunities and unable to participate fully in the economy and benefit from it. The federal partnership on infrastructure has declined steadily since the 1960s. Today, much of our nation's infrastructure is approaching the end of its useful life. Failing water and sewer systems, wastewater, slow broadband speeds, and deteriorating roads lessen our quality of life and impede American commerce. Our nation's ports, which drive our economy, require better landside and waterside connections to facilitate trade and to just so we remain globally competitive. America's crumbling infrastructure also increases the congestion and pollution while compromising our safety. Failure to close America's infrastructure investment gap has serious economic consequences, including higher costs for American families, workers, business. We have lack of GDP gain and millions of jobs lost. We all pay the price when we fail to invest in our country's infrastructure. Let me repeat that. We all pay that price. Globally, we risk falling behind our economic competitors if we do not make the investments that we need today. China, for example, has prioritized the development of high-tech sectors and infrastructure in its Made in China 2025 state-led industrial plan, which aims to make China a leading force in high-tech manufacturing. The United States will require significant investments in its broadband and ICT infrastructure to keep pace with China and other competing economies, and to manage the evolution to a more technologically driven economy and society. The United States currently falls behind many other developed countries when it comes to the resilience and sustainability of our infrastructure as well. To meet the needs of the 21st century economy will require a robust federal funding, federal leadership, and a bold vision for how we can address our infrastructure needs. We must tackle long-standing, persistent inequalities as part of any infrastructure plan, so our investments lead to a brighter and more prosperous future for all Americans. We must also build more resilient and sustainable infrastructure to address the climate crisis and to protect our planet. Through infrastructure investments, we can pursue a trade agenda that puts everyday Americans first and supports the need of working families. Now, I hope to work with our colleagues across the aisle on what should be a bipartisan priority for us all. I think it's safe to say I have spent more time in the last 25 years reaching across the aisle, looking for bipartisan opportunities to move the infrastructure agenda forward. And I'll continue to be interested in ways that we can do that. But now is the time for action. And we have outstanding witnesses to tell us why and how. Before we turn to those witnesses, however, let me turn to Mr. Buchanan, our ranking member, for 5 minutes of commentary. Vern, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing on advancing U.S. economic competitiveness, equity, and sustainability through infrastructure investing. Our Trade Subcommittee hearing on infrastructure in the last Congress clearly showed that there is a bipartisan agreement on the need for strong and effective infrastructure to maintain our competitive edge on the global stage and to create jobs. I hope we can work together, and I believe we can, on a bipartisan basis to find practical solutions, particular infrastructure that supports our trade competitiveness. And with our witnesses here today, I also want to thank them for taking the time to be here. It's also my pleasure to have a witness testifying from my home state of Florida, Mr. Anderson. It is great to have you before the subcommittee. I look forward to your testimony and continuing our work in Tampa Bay to strengthen our local economy, especially as Florida leads the economic recovery from the effects of the pandemic. Trade is such a positive and dynamic force for the people of Florida. In fact, 1 in 5 jobs in Florida are trade related. Our ports infrastructure investment have paid off considerably, making Florida the gateway to the Caribbean and Latin America. We've seen significant growth in exports from Florida in recent years, reaching as high as $56 billion in 2019. 15 seaports fuel our state economy. Port Tampa Bay alone moves over 37 million cargo tons a year and supports over 85,000 one port, good paying jobs, many of which are in my district. This success story demonstrates that smart and effective investments in our infrastructure benefits workers and makes us more competitive in the world. However, infrastructure is just one aspect of being competitive. We must also prioritize growth and a strong economy. Republicans support pro-growth pro-trade growth, tax and regulatory policies that make us more competitive and create jobs. That's why I'm concerned about the administration's moratorium on trade negotiation. Trade agreements like USMCA grow the economy, makes us more competitive, supporting American workers with good jobs and high standards. While I can understand the desire of any new administration to conduct its own analysis before negotiating new agreements, time is of the essence. Without an aggressive trade negotiating agenda, America will lose its influence abroad and here at home. Countries that don't share our values, like China, will step up and fill the void. There's no question that even our friendly competitors and trading partners will continue to negotiate new agreements all around the world, leaving us behind. I hope the administration will reverse course and promptly consult with our committee about a plan to re-engage in countries like the UK, Kenya, Japan, and the EU. We must also keep in mind that infrastructure projects in the U.S. are among the most expensive in the world due to substantial regulatory burdens. Some important Republican priorities in this area include streamlining how we build and maintain our infrastructure and maximize public-private partnerships to make infrastructure spending more cost-effective. This will allow us to leverage infrastructure spending as effectively as possible, allowing for more growth, competitiveness, and more good-paying jobs. I'm also very opposed to the tax hikes that the Biden administration proposes. Higher taxes will make us less competitive, the U.S. less competitive, and hamper our economic recovery, sending jobs overseas, and lower wages. Higher taxes will cost jobs. That's simply a fact. In terms, they are not a pro-worker policy. Let's come together in a bipartisan way to find cost-effective and efficient solutions to our infrastructure challenges. If we do this right, we can make America hum by facilitating growth and good jobs to benefit American workers and families. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing. And I want to thank the witnesses for taking their time to be here today. I look forward to their testimony. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Buchanan. I look forward to engaging you and others on the important tax provisions that the administration has provided. I think there's a robust discussion to be had, and I look forward to that. I take your point about working with the administration on trade. We're soon going to have Ambassador Tai join us to deal with the trade agenda of the administration. I think it's going to be a very productive one. And I think due to the long-term relationship our subcommittee has with the ambassador, that we'll have plenty of opportunity to interact with her, and I look forward to it. First, now let's turn to the opening statements from our witnesses. The first witness is the Honorable Byron Brown, the mayor of Buffalo, New York. Our next witness will be Mario Cordario, the the executive director of the Port of Long Beach and the chairman of the board of the American Association of Port Authorities. Next, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, founder and director of the Michigan State University and Hurley Child's Hospital Pediatric Public Health Initiative. Our fourth witness will be Stan Santos, legislative chair for the Communication Workers of America's Coastal Valley Council. Our fifth witness is Ms. Fawn Sharp, president of the National Congress of American Indians. And sixth will be Dr. Nicole Turner Lee, director of the Center for Technology Innovation and a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. Our final witness is Mr. Paul Anderson, the president and CEO of Port Tampa Bay. Each of your statements will be made part of the record in its entirety. I would ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less. And to help you keep that, please keep an eye on the clock that should be pinned to your screen. If you go over time, I'll notify you with a gentle tap of the gavel. Before recognizing Mayor Brown, I would like to provide our colleague, Representative Higgins, the opportunity for a few introductory comments. And let me say, I deeply appreciate, Brian, you're helping facilitate the mayor's presence here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my great pleasure to introduce the Honorable Byron W. Brown. He is the mayor of the city of Buffalo to testify before the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Trade. Mayor Brown is in his fourth term as mayor of New York's second largest city. Under his leadership, the city has made tremendous progress toward reversing the decline caused by bad trade policies over the past half century. Today, Buffalo is experiencing a renaissance, and the city is growing once more in population, in jobs, and in opportunity. Mayor Brown is leading Buffalo's rebirth. He knows the value of infrastructure and how it impacts our communities and affects our quality of life. I welcome him here today, and I look forward to hearing his testimony.
Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to be with you today. Congressman Higgins, thank you for your partnership and your generous introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Trade regarding the lack of federal infrastructure funding and how it has hurt the competitiveness of cities. I'd like to open by expressing my support for President Biden's American Jobs Plan because it restores the traditional partnership between the federal government and local municipalities on infrastructure funding, which used to provide working class families the opportunity to have a good home in a stable neighborhood and allowed communities to sustain a healthy pace of development. Since the 1960s, Buffalo's tax base, like that of other manufacturing cities, changed rapidly. Suburban development drew a greater number of middle-class homeowners away, and cities were deprived of the solid economic base they relied on to fund services, maintain property values, and attract employers. As a result, our infrastructure deteriorated with the relatively little funding available going mostly to maintenance and repairs. Meanwhile, the costs of even this work, which continues to accelerate, are being borne by the residents who can least afford it. The key to ending this cycle and restoring a sense of equity to our infrastructure funding is having a re-engaged federal partner. Buffalo's economy, because of our proximity to the Canadian border and Toronto, is heavily dependent on foreign trade and tourism. Canada is New York State's #1 export market, with over $19 billion in goods and services crossing into Canada annually. New technologies, new services, and new modes of transportation are emerging at a rapid pace. We must have an infrastructure that will be able to meet the demands that trade in the 21st century will require. That means that our infrastructure must be capable of supporting the autonomous electric vehicles that are becoming a greater segment of the transportation industry. These low or no carbon vehicles will rely on the presence of sensors, communications devices, and a charging infrastructure, which we should lay the foundation for now. Trade will also take on an increasingly digital aspect, with the information being shared between universities, financial institutions, and biomedical researchers being just as important as the goods which move across our border. To do this, our information infrastructure must have greater capacity, be more secure, and provide greater accessibility to every resident. That last component is critical to ending some of the racial, economic, and wealth disparities that have left too many Black and brown children without internet access during the pandemic, while other children who lived just a half mile or less away had excellent connections. The ability to move goods and people by rail must also be improved if cities are to remain competitive. This will mean dedicated lines for high-speed rail between metro areas like Buffalo and Toronto, as well as greater commercial rail capacity so that our reliance on other carbon-producing modes of transit shrinks. Through the right kind of infrastructure funding, the kind outlined in the American Jobs Plan, which advances our concept of infrastructure beyond just the roads and bridges built in the last century, we have an opportunity to grow our economy in an equitable and inclusive way. When we think of infrastructure as an investment in our water and sewer systems, so our children grow up in healthy homes, in our civic infrastructure, so that cultural institutions become public spaces that help heal racial and social divides through art and dialogue, in our digital infrastructure, so that every resident can fully participate in the economic, social, and educational life of our nation, and in our human infrastructure, so that the people who are the ultimate users of these systems are leading healthy, safe, and productive lives, then we can envision a more prosperous America that benefits every resident. Again, thank you all very much for giving me the opportunity to testify before you today.
Thank you very much, Mayor Brown, for your testimony. We deeply appreciate it. Our next witness, Mr. Mario Cordario, the Executive Director of the Port of Long Beach and the Chairman of the Board of the American Association of Port Authorities. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Mario Cordario. I am the Executive Director of the Port of Long Beach and Chairman of the Board of the American Association of Port Authorities. Chairman Blumenauer, we appreciate your long-standing support and commitment to infrastructure and recognizing the important role that ports in the United States play in our economy. The Port of Long Beach is a premier U.S. gateway for trans-Pacific trade and a trailblazer in innovative goods movement, safety, environmental stewardship, and sustainability. As the second busiest container seaport in the United States, the port handles trade valued at $200 billion annually and supports 2.6 million jobs across the nation. Goods movement through the Port of Long Beach originates in and are destined to every congressional district in the mainland of the United States. Together with the Port of Los Angeles, the San Pedro Bay Port Complex moves more than 40% of our nation's waterborne goods. U.S. maritime ports generate $5.4 trillion in economic activity annually, representing 26% of our nation's GDP. Ports are responsible for 38.8 million direct, induced, and indirect jobs. Today, I would like to discuss 4 areas of infrastructure investment that are critical to meeting our current supply chain needs and expanding U.S. exports in the global market: rail, sustainability, energy resiliency, and a comment on port operations and policy. As to rail, the port is committed to reducing congestion and air emissions that are harmful to our neighborhoods and the region. We see on-dock rail capabilities as providing a critical environmental benefit by enabling more containers to be loaded directly on rail, thereby reducing the number of trucks required to serve the port. The port is investing over $1 billion in on-dock rail capacity, which will allow us to move containers here at the Port of Long Beach by the year 2030 at the percentile 35%. The Association of American Port Authorities has identified $20 billion in multimodal and rail access needs at U.S. ports. We respectfully ask Congress to allocate the $20 billion through the Department of Transportation's existing Port Infrastructure Development Program for coastal port infrastructure and intermodal freight movement connectors. As to sustainability, robust funding is also needed to create sustainable goods movement economy that benefits the environment and improves air quality around the nation's busiest trade corridors. Government investments of at least $50 billion are needed for electrification of dockside ship connections and zero and near zero emission port equipment. The port's Cleaner Action Plan has resulted in significant reduction of harmful emissions. Continued implementation of the Cleaner Action Plan with a quest for zero emission port operations will cost approximately $14 billion. Federal dollars are needed to advance the environmental responsible, ambitious initiatives. Energy resiliency. Renewable energy technologies, other self-generation systems, controls, and energy storage will allow the port to isolate operations from the local energy grid during times of emergency and outage. The AAPA is advocating $500 million be included in any large-scale infrastructure investment package for port development in support of offshore wind energy, as identified by the administrations necessary to catalyze the development of offshore wind at scale. These funds are critical to strengthening our docks for storage, assembly, and transport of offshore wind energy components. As to policy, in addition to infrastructure investment in the United States, I wish to keep up with the global economy and increase of its market share. We need to create a new business model in this country. Ports in Asia and some ports in Europe operate 24/7. In the US, no port operates 24/7. The Port of Long Beach is advocating a changing business model. It requires a seismic shift, not only for our docks, but throughout the entire supply chain, trucks, warehouses, and manufacturing. U.S. ports are also exploring expanded use of the Maritime Administration's Marine Highways program to accomplish freight distribution. Freights unloaded from ship to dock and then transferred to a barge has the harbor maintenance tax applied twice, once for imported cargo and a second time as domestic cargo is serving an impediment to the marine highway use. Travel and tourism count as huge American net exports and are a major competitive advantage for our country. Let's safely open the tourism and cruise sector as the government is permitting with other sectors. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, ports optimize trade and goods movement. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the ports were proven to be an essential operation, moving life-saving PPE and advocating for testing and vaccines. We build and invest even in crisis. Ports serve as an engine of economic prosperity in our communities and provide success in markets across the globe. But we cannot do this alone. America's ports need repairs, improvements, and upgrades. America's ports need government investment. Federal investment in port infrastructure will be critical to ensuring that the U.S. has a 21st century multimodal freight network to compete globally and deliver locally. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
No, thank you for the testimony, and we deeply appreciate your leadership with the port sector across the country. Next, we're turning to Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, founder and director of Michigan State University and Hurley's Children's Hospital Pediatric Health Initiative. And I would like to turn to Mr. Kildee for a more elaborate and appropriate introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me this opportunity to introduce Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha and for holding this important hearing. Dr. Mona, as we call her, is a Michigan State University pediatrician who leads a critical children's medical clinic serving the kids of Flint. She also helps run the Flint lead registry through the Centers for Disease Control to help Flint and really our whole country work to eliminate lead exposure. And I especially want to thank my colleagues, Representatives Pascrell, Moore, Panetta, Horsford, and Davis for supporting my recent efforts to fund this critical registry. Dr. Mona is really the hero who exposed the water crisis in my hometown of Flint. When state officials were telling Flint residents that the water was fine, Dr. Mona exposed through children's blood level data that there was something wrong. Dr. Mona embodies the spirit of the people of my hometown of Flint. She's persistent, she's unwavering in her convictions, she's an incredible advocate on behalf of children in Flint and everywhere, and she's someone with a huge heart. So I'm really glad to have her here today to talk about the importance of water infrastructure. Nobody knows the consequence of the failure of that form of infrastructure better than Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. So, Dr. Mona. We may have temporarily lost Dr. Mona, it looks like.
Well, if she doesn't reappear quickly, we'll move on and come back to her. Well, that was a terrific introduction, Dan.
Yep. I'll have to do it again, apparently.
Okay. Then let's move to our fourth witness, Mr. Stan Santos, the Legislative Chair for the Communication Workers of America's Coastal Valley Council. Mr. Santos, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Blumenauer and Ranking Member Buchanan and members of the subcommittee. My name is Stan Santos, and I live in California's Central Valley. I've been a splicing technician with AT&T for 22 years and a proud member of the Communication Workers of America. Beginning in 1999, I worked in Silicon Valley building high-speed DSL systems for 3.5 years. There, as in other high-income communities, schools were being connected to the internet and students began to receive smart devices. I returned to the Central Valley in 2003. Today, in the farm worker communities surrounding Fresno, many homes, including those in newly built subdivisions, still rely on the same DSL speeds with barely 6 megabits per second that was impressive 20 years ago. They lack infrastructure for high-speed broadband. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley and affluent neighborhoods in North Fresno are wired with gigabit fiber. With the pandemic, the smoldering crisis of digital redlining has become a 5-alarm emergency. I've been visiting families and testing internet hotspots provided by school districts. I found extremely slow speeds and unreliable connections. These Wi-Fi hotspots are built with the lowest tier of connectivity to scattered rural cell towers. They are asymmetrical, with upload speeds that are a fraction of their marginal download speeds. So the kids may be able to see the teacher, but the teacher can't always see them. One rural school district I'm working in has over 3,600 students, has given out over 1,800 Wi-Fi hotspots. That suggests the majority of these families lacked any internet connection before the pandemic. Hotspots are inadequate and unsustainable, and we need affordable, upgraded, hardwired connections. Private sector underinvestment, the absence of competition, and decades of deregulation have really created a deeply harmful digital divide. 36% of US households do not have a broadband connection that meets the FCC speed definition. Access is stratified by race and income. A report that CAA authored with the National Digital Inclusion Alliance found that AT&T had made fiber to the home available for fewer than 1/3 of the households in its footprint. Today, the US sits far below many other wealthy countries in fiber access, with 31% of locations covered compared to over 95% in some countries. We need bold action to encourage greater broadband deployment. We need a bill that invests $80 billion in funding for broadband builds with proven technologies and strong accountability measures. The Accessible, Affordable Internet for All Act and the Biden administration's American Jobs Plan would accomplish this. This legislation would jumpstart broadband deployment in underserved communities and help close the digital divide. The $80 billion needed to close the broadband gap would employ many skilled technicians who are currently unemployed due to a series of industry layoffs. This investment would create 200,000 construction and technician job years and over 600,000 supply chain and induced job years. This doesn't even reflect the job growth that would result from new businesses that would flourish in all communities when they have broadband. But any broadband infrastructure bill must include standards that ensure the workers who build and maintain these networks can exercise their rights free from employer coercion and intimidation. The bill must strengthen accountability by prohibiting outsourcing to low-wage subcontractors to circumvent collective bargaining agreements. To ensure that the American Jobs Plan creates those good jobs across the economy, Congress should follow President Biden's proposal and include Protecting the Rights to Organize Act. Many workers can't organize in collective bargaining because of weak accountability measures for employers who intimidate or fire workers for exercising their rights. The PRO Act would help correct this power imbalance. As we emerge from the COVID-19 crisis, it's crucial that we build back better than before. We must ensure all communities have access to broadband, an essential utility in today's society, just like electricity and water. Achieving universal access will require leadership from the federal government and significant investment so these communities finally receive the internet access they deserve. That will also support their inclusion in our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. We probably should have used your skill to try and get Dr. Mona back. We're working on that. But in the meantime, let me turn to Congresswoman Delbeni for our next introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am so excited to welcome President Von Sharp to the subcommittee today. President Sharp, thank you for being here and for lending your expertise to our committee on the infrastructure needs of tribal nations. President Sharp served as the 23rd president of the National Congress of American Indians, the oldest, largest, and most representative American Indian and Alaska Native tribal government organization in the country. And she is the third woman to hold the position of NCAI president. She is also the current vice president of the Quinault Indian Nation on the Pacific coast of Washington State after being a 5-term past president. And she has held numerous leadership positions, both appointed by Governor Gary Locke to serve as a trustee for Grace Harbor College, served as governor of the Washington State Bar Association, a trustee of the Washington State Bar Association, and she is incredibly knowledgeable and has served in leadership, addressing so many issues across our country. She graduated from Gonzaga University in Spokane and got her law degree from the University of Washington, and has also received certificates from the National Judicial College at the University of Nevada and in international human rights law at the University of Oxford. So as a fellow Washingtonian, I'm so proud to welcome you before this committee, and I look forward to your testimony. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Anjik Hiwishka, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of the National Congress of American Indians, I thank you for holding this hearing. I am Fawn Sharp, President of NCAI. Investing in Indian country's infrastructure is critical to tribal nations' economies and the health, safety, and welfare of our citizens and surrounding communities. Tribal nations maintain and develop essential infrastructure and create jobs that sustain their regional economies and play a critical role in advancing the United States' energy independence. Unfortunately, for decades, the federal government has recognized that its trust and treaty responsibility to tribal nations has been chronically underfunded. As a result, Indian country has substandard infrastructure in every sector, and this crisis has been documented in multiple reports by the United States Commission on Civil Rights, including the most recently in its 2018 Broken Promises report. The statistics are both shocking and harrowing. These disparities increase our vulnerability to the COVID-19 pandemic and resulted in our communities having, at times, the highest per capita COVID infection, hospitalization, and death rates in the United States. To recover and rebuild from our current crises, the United States must support tribal economies. And in supporting our tribal economies, we also suggested and submitted a letter on April 13th, 2021, along with 30 tribal organizations. We sent a letter to Congress addressing comprehensive tribal legislative priorities in these areas. The letter was incorporated in my written testimony, and today my testimony will focus on infrastructure financing parity, energy independence, and climate resiliency. First, I'll discuss tribal tax parity. In addition to underfunding of the existing tribal infrastructure programs, tribal nations encounter barriers to financing public goods such as infrastructure and energy development. While the Supreme Court has long recognized tribal inherent sovereign authority to tax on tribal lands, state and local governments often attempt to tax economic activities on those same lands. This dual taxation creates disincentives to invest in businesses on tribal lands and results in tribal nations often foregoing their inherent right to tax so that they can retain private investment. Forfeiture of this critical revenue, in turn, contributes to the distressed economic conditions that exist on many tribal lands. Due to dual taxation, generation of revenue through tribal economic development and achieving governmental parity under the tax code are especially critical in order to support tribal trade and commerce in tribal economies. Congress has both a trust and treaty responsibility to ensure federal tax policy affords tribal nations the same opportunities as other governments to provide for their citizens. Despite this obligation, the tax code does not provide to tribal nations many of the benefits, incentives, and protections available to state and local governments. This disparity places tribal nations at a disadvantage when it comes to financing infrastructure and energy development. One example is bond financing. Presently, state and local governments can issue tax-exempt bond debt for commercial activities, while tribal governments are not able to issue the same bonds. We're only allowed to issue bonds for economic development activity for essential government functions. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 created a pilot program titled Tribal Economic Development Bonds that established a $2 billion volume cap and permitted tribal governments to finance projects on par with state governments. The cap has been met, and the Department of Treasury's report on the program recognized the value of TEDBs and has supported tribal government bond parity. Equitable bond authority are one of the many tax parity asks that are essential to supporting tribal financing of public goods. Next, I'll discuss energy and climate action. The energy resources of tribal nations are vast and critical to tribal and national energy security and the reduction of greenhouse gases. Despite this potential, tribal nations encounter significant financial and regulatory barriers to developing resources within their own homelands, including access to existing infrastructure and financing energy development. Comprehensive investment in energy access and development is needed for community and utility scale projects. Energy investment also provides opportunity to support climate action. Tribal nations are at the front lines of the climate crisis, responding to sea level rise, coastal erosion, and increased frequency and intensity of wildfires. Due to these impacts, tribal nations are key partners in the national and global response to climate change and have the capacity to bridge the divide between traditional and renewable energy. To support this partnership, Congress must pass legislation that includes full and meaningful consultation with decision makers, funding of climate action via increased appropriations, grants, and public-private financing opportunities, and ensure government parity in climate action by including tribal nations in federally funded responses to the climate crisis. In conclusion, I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to any questions. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating testimony. I look forward to our being able to explore some of the challenges of the dual taxation issues. I hear via Congressman Kildee that Dr. Mona is back with us, and he advises that she'll be able to also comment on reliable broadband. Doctor?
Yes, I am here, and that was actually all planned to support
Oh, okay. We might have you switch off the video to see if that will give you an opportunity to speak to us, and we'll be able to at least hear you. Could you try that? Okay. Well, I see Dr. Turner Lee, and perhaps, Doctor, we could turn to you while we continue with our broadband journey here.
Sure thing, sure thing.
Thank
Okay. Just for introduction, I'm Dr. Nicole Turner Lee. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, as well as the director of the Center for Technology Innovation there. First and foremost, I want to thank the chairman, as well as the ranking member Buchanan and the distinguished members of this committee for this opportunity to testify. And in my work, I look at these issues, particularly broadband infrastructure and digital inclusion, and I'm a soon-to-be author of a new book that looks at the U.S. digital divide. I want to first applaud the committee, the White House and Congress for looking at this issue of high-speed broadband as a critical infrastructure asset. We know that broadband networks deliver significant benefits for citizens in the areas of education, employment, healthcare, government services, and banking. Smart infrastructure is also significant to the vitality and longevity of energy, waste, and transport systems. And the White House's American Jobs Plan recently referred to broadband as the new electricity by comparing it to the rural electrification movement. And I would expound on this notion and consider broadband to be more than a connector, but an enabler of individual and community capacities that improves upon the lives of residents in their communities. My testimony today just touches upon 3 points as we think about the role of broadband in improving economic empowerment and competitiveness. First, digital infrastructure must be deployed equally and accurately. Accurate national and local broadband mapping must direct us to the communities and people least served, especially high-need areas that populations who are rural, urban, suburban, and tribal are in most need. Second, consumer adoption and workforce training are keys to producing workforce opportunities for residents, business owners, and entrepreneurs who are critical to creating new futures on these emerging platforms. And my third and final point is that broadband must be equity deployed and available throughout the U.S., especially in areas where the lack of access has foreclosed on the opportunities for people of color and the economically vulnerable. This new round of infrastructure investments must promise to close the digital divide and avoid widening systemic inequalities, including racism, poverty, and social isolation. These 3 points are included in what I've coined America's Tech New Deal, a proposal to deepen private sector investments in high-speed broadband networks while forging ahead with new models that leverage this critical infrastructure for job creation, small business expansion, and the reimagined delivery of services, including remote education, work, and healthcare. We saw this under FDR, but it wouldn't be until Truman and the Fair Deal that we would see that it would be equitable and just. And members of the committee, this is important because the pandemic has essentially seen these types of statistics. An estimated 71% of US employed adults work remotely, up 20% prior to the outbreak. 73 of our nation's 100 largest K-12 public schools only offer remote classes or hybrid models. And people's daily lives, from shopping to funeralizing loved ones, is now taking place online. And given these trends, broadband will seemingly play a permanent role in our lives, and that's why it's critical infrastructure. In addition to that, as you mentioned, we have to ensure that as we build it, we put people to work and we leverage it in a way that we do not impose upon those who are already digitally invisible, a concept that I talk about in my book after touring the country and meeting people in housing who are of color, who are poor, who live in areas like tribal nations or tribal lands or rural areas who have been left behind. These 3 points that I'm trying to make point to the lack of access, cost, and adoption. And while we can go into those questions during the full comments, and they're also in my testimony, it's very important that we have data on access so we do not overbuild, and we think about future-proofing broadband models so that we can include a series of technological solutions and be more technology agnostic than preferencing just fiber. We've got to figure out how to do this in ways that we can use white spaces, 5G, cable, and other resources to connect people. When it comes to cost, we have some models from the pandemic that are working. The emergency broadband benefit should be permanent to allow for greater subsidies to families, low-cost broadband programs, and I would say this, we need to officially and permanently bring wiring to public housing and other federally assisted entities. And finally, we cannot build infrastructure without adoption and use. As it was mentioned, the school kids who were sitting on the stoops of Taco Bells and McDonald's before the pandemic are still sitting on the same stoop trying to do their homework. And so it's important in that case, as well as in health, that we focus on ways to put the same amount of investment in adoption programs as we do in infrastructure, as well as costs. With those things, the Tech New Deal that I'm suggesting as I wrap up my testimony really starts with 4 points. Let's collect some real data and let's get investments to people with the most need first before we overbuild or we saturate marketplaces that already have broadband access. Let's reform universal service so this down payment on broadband is complemented by money we already have allocated to ensure that it is affordable and we can actually subsidize these types of investments. And third, I would just say this, as you've mentioned, let's pair infrastructure with workforce development in an intentional way so that we can put people back to work the way we tried to do after the Great Depression, and let's do it equitably. As Majority Whip Clyburn has told me, let's make this a Tech New Deal that's fair, inclusive, and accessible to all. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions that come from the committee.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that concept of digitally invisible. I don't see Dr. Mona, so what you can all look forward to is that Dan Kildee is going to be texting and calling you all, delivering his version of that testimony. And we look forward to that, Dan, if we don't get Dr. Mona before we're through. But now, continuing the theme dealing with our port infrastructure, our final witness is Mr. Paul Anderson, the President and CEO of the Port of Tampa Bay. Mr. Anderson, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, and distinguished committee members. My name is Paul Anderson, and I'm President and CEO of Port Tampa Bay. Thank you for holding this hearing this afternoon. I also serve alongside our Chairman, Mario Cordario, on the board of the American Association of Port Authorities and serve as Vice Chair of the Coalition for America's Gateways and Trade Corridors. Ports and maritime commerce play a critical role in international trade. Commerce facilitated by ports generates $378 billion annually in federal, state, and local taxes. Port Tampa Bay is Florida's largest and most diverse port with an $18 billion economic impact, supporting 85,000 direct, indirect, and induced jobs. Notably, we serve as Central Florida's energy gateway, moving about 45% of the state's petroleum needs. This includes jet fuel for Tampa and Orlando international airports, as well as the fuel needed to support the cars and buses and trucks moving our residents and visitors and cargo. Containers are our fastest growing line of business. Port Tampa Bay is the closest and most efficient gateway to the Tampa I-4 Orlando corridor, and this area is home to the largest concentration of distribution centers in the state and one of the hottest industrial real estate markets in the nation. So many of the world's top shipping companies call it Tampa due to the investments we've made in the port's infrastructure, matching federal grant awards with our local funds. Importantly, every dollar invested in infrastructure yields a $2 to $3 return on economic growth. Port Tampa Bay works closely with our terminal operator, Ports America, and is in the middle of a multi-phased expansion, including dredging to accommodate larger vessels. Port Tampa Bay's infrastructure needs are significant, and we rely on our strong working relationship with the state and federal partners. We recently completed our biggest project, Big Ben Dredging. We brought together the federal government, the state of Florida, our port, and two of our major private partners, Mosaic and Tico Energy. This dredging project created expanded access to international shipping lanes by allowing larger vessels to call at Port Tampa Bay. Celadon Development Corporation is a significant new manufacturing venture that will take recycled cardboard, use 1.2 million gallons per day of reclaimed water from our partners at the City of Tampa, and create a new recycled product for export. This $400 million private capital investment project, which at full capacity will support over 200 jobs and generate 1 million tons of recycled paper fiber for export each year. This public-private partnership will reduce our trade imbalance through the sustainable production of recycled goods. Port Tampa Bay engaged in another P3 to open a refrigerated warehouse, which is operated by Port Logistics Refrigerated Services. This facility has seen incredible growth and uses cutting-edge technology for the refrigeration and fumigation and has an important productive partnership with federal and state inspectors. Increased trade flows from Latin America means that this facility is already in need and ready for expansion. As the United States is able to continue to negotiate bilateral and multilateral trade agreements to ensure the price consistency and other regulatory needs, facilities like this will continue to grow. In closing, Port Tampa Bay has experienced strong, sustained growth in collaboration with major international shipping lines, thanks to the unique location and infrastructure that our port offers. Also, the multilateral and bilateral trade agreements considered by this committee contribute to the positive growth we've seen in our diverse imports. These agreements have contributed to the growth of commerce flowing through our port and support the 17-county region we serve. Our port, our state, and our nation thrive on international trade. This committee has done a great job in supporting and fostering positive trade agreements and our nation's relationship with international trading partners. I'm proud to offer my support for improvements in this area, and I stand ready to assist this committee however I can. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. We appreciate your testimony as well. I must say I'm getting a little car sick looking at Congressman Rice and what's going on out the window. But we do have Dr. Mona back. This is an effort by Dan Kilby to try and build suspense for this testimony. I think it's working, Doctor. The floor is yours.
Thank you. My sincere apologies. I wish I could have said that I did that on purpose to support our broadband efforts and the need to invest in broadband infrastructure, but it was not done on purpose. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, good. Just want to make sure. All right. So thank you, Congressman Kilby. Thank you for that kind welcome. Congressman Kilby's North Star has always been the best interest and the greatest potential of our children. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, and everybody else that's part of this committee. Infrastructure is a critical topic, as you've all said, and I am pleased that the subcommittee is voting today's hearing fit, especially as it relates to drinking water. And one of the advantages of doing this virtually, and definitely not the internet connection, but is I get to share things with you that I couldn't probably bring to the Capitol. This right here is a lead pipe, and I'm so glad my video works. In Flint's history, before the water crisis, lead pipes were probably best known for beating union organizers, especially during our historic sit-down strike. And sadly, as we've learned firsthand in Flint, there's more than one way to hurt people with lead pipes. My friend Harold Harrington gave me this pipe a couple days ago. Harold is a Flint master plumber, a member of United Association UA 370, which is the local union of plumbers and pipe fitters. Harold and his colleagues have been working tirelessly to replace Flint pipes. This is actually the first pipe that was replaced in Flint. And I think you can appreciate that our pipes are like straws. You see that? They're just like drinking water straws. But in Flint and in cities across this country, these straws are made of a poison with no safe level, a poison that erodes cognition and twists behavior and can forever alter the trajectory of children. And you never really know when a piece of that poison is going to come off our straws and go into our drinking water and ultimately into the bodies of our children. And I want to show you another lead pipe. This is another lead pipe that came from the home of Oscar and Elizabeth Brown. In the 1950s, the Browns moved from Mississippi plant, and they lived in Flint, raising and nurturing generations of their family. Their entire family, including Dana, their great grandson, drank water from this lead pipe. And to this day, my heart breaks knowing that lead poisoned water was filling baby bottles and sippy cups. Dana has had health problems, including seizures. And I wish there was something as a pediatrician that I could prescribe to take away what happened in Flint. But when it comes to lead, the only cure is prevention. Our decades long inaction to invest in infrastructure failed the children of Flint. But Flint's crisis was not the first, the last, or the worst. The US was stubbornly slow to respect science and didn't restrict the use of lead pipes until 1986. And we don't even know, but we think there's about 9 million lead lines in the country. And we're almost done replacing our lead pipes in Flint. And so is another post-crisis city, Newark, New Jersey. Utilizing the expertise of highly skilled plumbers and pipe fitters like Harold, Flint and Newark are doing this critical infrastructure work faster than ever before. And as a pediatrician, I would be remiss if I did not say that the ill effects of poverty and income inequality also manifest in the bodies and in the blunted potential of children. So it is a public health priority that our pipes are replaced by men and women in union jobs making a living wage. But it shouldn't take crises to reactively ensure safe drinking water or living wage jobs. I fully support President Biden's plan to remove 100% of our lead pipes as quickly as possible. And as we strive to eliminate inequities and implement environmental justice and anti-racist policies, water infrastructure work, especially lead pipe work, should be prioritized in historically disadvantaged communities. These investments are not just about pipes and plumbing. They are about people and our potential to right historic wrongs. And some will argue about the cost, but the cost of inaction is unaffordable. The economic cost of lead exposure includes lost productivity and earnings, and greater healthcare, mental health, criminal justice, and special education costs. For every lead pipe replaced, there is a 33% societal return on investment. It makes economic sense. And I spoke a lot about lead, and as Congressman Kildee knows, I could probably go on for hours, but I also want to share that our overall water infrastructure is outdated, it is fragile, and also a threat to our public health. From addressing emerging contaminants like the forever chemicals, the PFAS chemicals, to ensuring safe drinking water during extreme weather conditions, investments in infrastructure are critical for our global competitiveness. In closing, I want to come back to this lead pipe, this toxic straw, right? This pipe and the millions like it belong down the street at the Smithsonian. I look forward to the museum exhibits and the history books showcasing that time when the leaders of our great nation, you guys, boldly took action to invest not only in our drinking water infrastructure, but also in the foundation of our nation's greatest and most valuable resource, our children. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Mona. It was well worth waiting for. I think that's compelling that the only cure is prevention. I will just have one question because I want to make sure my colleagues have an opportunity to deal with this amazing series of panelists. But I would like to just direct it to President Sharp, if I could. You highlight in your testimony the substandard infrastructure in Indian country and how these infrastructure disparities dramatically increase the vulnerability of American Indians and Alaskan Natives during the COVID-19 pandemic. You highlight some of the funding inequities, which I thought was really compelling. But I wondered if you could just focus for a moment on what we should be doing to support and amplify Native communities' efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change in our country and your sense of infrastructure priorities for Indian country.
Excellent question. I really appreciate the question on climate change. Some of the significant things that I think would be very helpful is including tribal nations at the table at all levels. Right now, we actively engage in climate policy at the local, national, regional, and international levels. And I think having an opportunity to see from our perspective what it means to envision how we can best recover and confront the impacts of climate change. We need to not only focus on new and emerging science and technology, but also the thousands of years of knowledge and wisdom and traditional ecological knowledge that we do possess, and direct investments in tribal nation infrastructure in every sector is going to help only strengthen us and ensure that we play our part in providing the economic recovery and success that the United States also envisions.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point about millennia of experience with Native people and how to rebalance that equation. I appreciate your testimony. As I say, let me just turn now so that other committee members have an opportunity. Congressman Buchanan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a critical and timely hearing, and I want to appreciate, because we work on a bunch of things together. We want to do everything we can to work together on a bipartisan basis. Let me mention Mr. Anderson. I've watched Paul, his incredible leadership. He's done an incredible job at the port. As he mentioned, 85,000 jobs, I think it was. It's unbelievable. But I wanted to touch on Mr. Anderson. As we look to the government, federal government, with all this spending, one of the things I think we have to be open-minded to is public-private partnerships. And you mentioned Big Ben Canal, widening that, expanding that. I know it's expensive, but talk a little bit about public-private partnerships and how you put that together.
Again, thank you, Ranking Member Buchanan, for having me today and inviting me to testify. Private-public partnerships have began with really the strategic location of our port and identifying companies that had an interest in expanding their infrastructure and supporting their customers. The ones that I mentioned both have very sustainable benefits to them, and in both cases, private equity partners invested hundreds of millions of dollars, and we matched those with revenue generated both by the port as well as some federal and state dollars. So we've not only brought together a private sector and partner, we've been able to work very closely with our state and federal partners to truly make this a winning strategy for investment in our port. And in many cases, it's making up, like the Big Ben, where we had Tico Energy and Mosaic. I think this was unprecedented, where private companies were investing in dredging a federal approved channel. So we're looking for additional opportunities to do this, and it's always another way to find infrastructure funding for our port.
Hey, Paul, I've got about 3 minutes and 2 questions extra. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of trade agreements like USMCA and us being aggressive on that front, whether it's Central and South America or European friends? Because I know you're one of the closest, not the closest ports to the Panama Canal, but maybe just touch on that quickly about the significance of trade agreements.
The USMCA is vital. Our 3 largest trading partners are Brazil, Mexico, and Canada. And it's really critical that our trading partners and the United States have clear regulatory guidance on our trade, as well as what the benefits are to those trading partners. And I believe it's still early in the process for seeing benchmarking benefits, but we're definitely seeing those. We just recently Mario Cordario, my friend and colleague, mentioned marine highways. We have a marine highway from Texas to Tampa, utilizing that, and that's a cargo coming from Mexico into Texas, and then using a barge instead of using trucks, and that is a direct benefit of the USMCA.
Let me ask you the last question. In terms of, I think you mentioned to me you were the first port dedicated to an environmental program, reducing air emissions, reducing waste, conserving energy. Maybe you could talk about that. I think you're one of the ports a leader, or the first port really to be that focused on environmental sensitive issues.
Well, I believe all ports are focused on environmental sustainability and bringing balance to what we do for consumers and American citizens. We have world-class bird nesting program with Audubon Society. We just last week had a port cleanup of trash, marine trash that's not from the port, but from surrounding communities. Over 500 volunteers removed 10 tons of trash from mangroves and other surrounding areas. And we have electrification of a lot of our equipment. And as well, we've installed digital infrastructure, which we feel is not only more efficient, it's also sustainable in the event of hurricane and other weather-related events.
Well, thank you, Paul. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan. Congressman Kind.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. And Mr. Chairman, first of all, thanks for your tremendous leadership through the years and trying to get us rallied in a bipartisan fashion for a major infrastructure reinvestment plan for our country, so we can start rebuilding America, rebuilding Wisconsin, rebuilding Oregon the way we need to. First, a quick story, Mr. Chairman, before I ask a question. I got up early in the morning, as I usually do, to run the city streets of my hometown in La Crosse. Today, it took me twice as long to complete the route because everyone who saw me out there was stopping me to talk to me about this pothole here, or this road that needed attention there, this bridge that we've been putting off for too long, the water system that needs attention. So the demand is out there, and the time couldn't be more perfect coming out of the coronavirus for us to be focused on this. And I commend all the witnesses for your excellent testimony here today. But let me start with you, Dr. Turner Lee. You mentioned Mr. Clyburn, and I've been participating with him in a national broadband task force. You know, this virus has really highlighted the digital divide like never before and the work ahead of us. Yes, we have to get good mapping to see where the shortfalls occur. Yes, we have to do a better job of understanding the different internet speeds, which is crucial as well. But my question to you is, we're going to need to partner, leverage public funds with the private sector. How do we get the private companies being rewarded these payments, the contracts, to do what they say they're going to do, rather than picking up and leaving, which happened in one of my communities in the northern part of my district recently, or stretching it out and taking 2 or 3 times as long? What type of oversight do you think we're going to need to do with the private sector on broadband build-out?
You know, thank you, Representative. I appreciate that question in particular, because as you know, with universal service, it's always been guided by a return on investment model. So we have to change that formula, because what the pandemic has demonstrated is there is a return on investment for everyone, and particularly for those that experience high rates of systemic inequality or are geographically isolated. So I do agree with you that we have to change the frame, right? We've got to change the equation, so that broadband access is not about market-based outcomes, but rather it's about creating an ecosystem where everybody can participate, particularly if we're going to reach 100% penetration. With that being the case, I do think Mr. Clyburn's bill on the adoption of an agency is really interesting, right? Because it places within the control, potentially under Commerce, an agency that is able to look at the metrics and the strategies for actually putting these solutions out there. The reason I went with the Tech New Deal, Congressman, was because I feel like there's several Post-it notes out there and they're not guided under one frame. And so I think it's important for us to also evaluate, not just because, waiting for the map to happen, but to evaluate where do we need to put these investments where we know it's going to have a duplicative investment in terms of the quality of life for residents, as well as the type of entrepreneurship and enterprise development that we want to see. So until we, again, go back and change those models in which we've looked at how we wholesale investment, until we change the preference of certain technologies and become more technology agnostic, and allow us to bring in different technologies that may work for smaller communities versus larger communities. And until we have an agency that is guided by these public-private sector partnerships and bring in civil society organizations, we're going to build a lot, but we may not have the demand that we need. And so to your point, I'm arguing, let's change these contribution guidelines. Let's bring a whole hands on deck strategy, and then let's focus on use cases. Maybe we need something like a No Child Left Offline initiative to just focus school leaders to close that divide. And so thinking about that may get to what you're talking about.
Thank you for that response. And, for the committee's information, we just had a great hearing in the Health Subcommittee too about telehealth and the importance of broadband expansion and closing the divide. I mean, Mr. Chairman, before my time, I'd be remiss as the representative with more miles on the Mississippi River than anyone else, that I hope as we move forward, we're also paying attention to the inland waterway infrastructure needs. I've got an aging lock and dam system up and down the Mississippi in the 1930s. It's being held by tape and bubble gum right now. Crucial route for exports, especially for advanced manufactured products, agriculture products here as well. And Ms. Sharp, I know we're running out of time and we won't be able to get into it, but I do draw your attention to my Tribal Tax and Investment Reform Act. We're hoping to reintroduce that in a bipartisan basis, bringing parity to tax treatment with tribal governments throughout the country, along with local governments. And I think that too will help deal with the infrastructure needs that we have. As a representative of the Ho-Chunk myself here in Wisconsin, St. Croix, Chippewa, the Oneida, the Potawatomi, I get a lot of feedback from them about the need for tax parity treatment within the tax code. So I look forward to working with you on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ron. I look forward to learning about your legislation, and I appreciate you referencing the challenges in the Mississippi-Missouri River system. Next, we have Congressman Nunes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity in the hearing today, and it's an opportune time, specifically as it relates to some of the challenges we're having on the West Coast as it relates to China. And Mr. Cordario, I'm just going to ask you a question. I'm only going to have this one question, so I just wanted to bring it to your attention, and I think give you an opportunity to walk us through what we should be looking at as some of these trade challenges that we're having, specifically with empty containers going back to Asia. So I know that there's been consistently in not only your port, but Oakland and others, there's been a challenge getting the containers unloaded, and then they're going back empty. There's been some news stories on that. So could you kind of walk us through, is this because there's not enough labor at the port? Is there just more traffic at the port? Is it all the above? It would really help the committee just to gain that understanding from your real world experience, because this is something we haven't seen, I think, for quite some time. Matter of fact, I was actually was flying over Long Beach a couple weeks ago, and I'd never seen so many ships and container ships that were out in the ocean there waiting to be unloaded. So take all the time that you need, but if you could just walk us through those challenges so we get a better understanding. I thank you.
Sure. Thank you for your question, Congressman. I think it's a great question, because the fact of the matter is every port gateway, I think it's fair to say, is experiencing a surge of imports. So primarily, what we're experiencing right now is the consumer demand here in the United States that has elevated at a point that we did not expect, obviously, a year ago. So suffice to say that added to that, the e-commerce model. You know, Americans now can shop what I term 24/7. You can shop at 10 at night, you can shop at 4 in the morning. So what does that mean? Well, we've had a huge demand from our imports, particularly in Asia. So what has happened is the international carriers are rushing to have those containers sent back to Asia to bring back more imports. In terms of the bottom line, what the international carriers are experiencing, I'm talking about these vessels that bring the containers to the West Coast or to the United States. They're charging now approximately, round figure, around $5,000 for that container to come from China to the West Coast. That is twice the charge now, twice the cost of that it was a year ago because of this demand. So how does that impact the question that you just asked? Well, these containers, of which we do not have enough of, are not being held here for the American exporter. They're being rushed back to Asia to, again, have that container with products to come back to the United States. So that's one reason. So I think one of the questions that we're learning here, lessons learned, is the importance of investment in infrastructure and equipment. So whether it's containers, whether it's chassis, whether it's rail cars, it has come to an inflection point in terms of what has meant to the U.S. ports. So I think that's a short answer to a very good question that you posed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cordario. And I know you've had a real challenge there, and obviously it's important, I think, for the Congress just to have a understanding of what you're dealing with. So some new circumstances that we haven't been used to. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time and opportunity, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Nunes. That was an important point, and I appreciate Mr. Cordario giving us the context to deal with it. I still have ringing in my ears the "no child left offline." I think that's terrific. I may use it, and I may not attribute it. May claim it for my own. It's terrific. All right, we now have Congressman Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for a very important hearing. I also want to thank all of the witnesses for their participation. I, too, like many others, have a great deal of concern in relationship to broadband and making sure that there is the opportunity all over the country for everybody to be connected. I also have an interest, though, because there are many people who don't have resources to purchase technology equipment. And that's why I introduced the Technology Equity Act. And of course, Dick Durbin introduced it in the Senate. And we're going to be working to try and make sure that individuals have the opportunity to acquire what they need. Dr. Lee, I heard you mention Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And anytime I hear anything about Roosevelt, my spirits go up. I'm a big fan of everything that took place during the New Deal. And I'm thinking, as we talk about infrastructure development and spending all of the money that we're going to be spending, in my community, in my district, in my city, more than half the young African-American males between the ages of 18 and 30 have never had a job during their lifetime, don't work, are not in school, not in any kind of training program. Do you see opportunity for any public sector employment in all of this? One of the features, quite frankly, of the New Deal dealt with some public sector employment that got people started, and then they were able to form these partnerships that we talk about. So what's your take on that?
Well, thank you, Congressman Davis. And for those of you who don't know, I have much respect and love for Congressman Davis because I went to Northwestern University and I actually worked on community service projects in his district right down the street from his office. So he's known me from a very young age, actually working in this space. Congressman, I think it goes back to a lot of the things that you used to talk about in the past, which is giving people a second chance if they were ex-offenders, but giving people a second chance at life. We all know, particularly for African-American males, that we have to find ways to improve upon their workforce development opportunities, given the plethora of experiences that they have. So there's a couple things that I would offer, which I think, again, kind of goes back to the previous question I was asked in terms of how do we create this runway? First and foremost, we have to move away from just a consumption idea of what this looks like, and we have to engage people on the production side of this new currency, which is our broadband infrastructure. With that being said, when we run into African-American males who may, for whatever reason, need that second chance, it's important for us to first work with the Department of Labor so that we can invest in more apprenticeships and credentialing programs. This is something that will work across the board, much like what Roosevelt did with the Civilian Corps, getting people back to work in areas that are protected jobs livable wage scale jobs, and they actually lend itself to not just fiber optics installation, but to computer troubleshooting in terms of customer service. I think we could do that. But right now, to all the members of Congress, the Department of Labor doesn't even have a code for these industries in 5G. So we've got to go back and do that legwork. I also think it's important, I'll just say this in just a couple of seconds to be able to give you more time back. We need a national civilian corps that's focused on digital service. What that means is we have a national service corps, and in the Biden plan, there's money allocated to service. What if we were to actually take paid civilians and teach them some of these skills so they can actually equip their communities, Black men, to work locally, to be able to build these networks and service these networks? Congressman, I am willing to work with you on that second, third, fourth, fifth chance, because I think at the end of the day, that's how we'll get it done.
Mayor Brown, could you just mention your experiences with this group of individuals, if there's still 30, 40 seconds? I think he's muted.
He's muted, yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that, Congressman. We've stood up programs in Buffalo, working with the Buffalo building trades for pre-apprenticeship opportunities. We've created employment opportunities in our public works department for members of the Black and Brown community to be able to work on infrastructure, sanitation, water, jobs like that are critically important to our community. So there is a place for this in the public sector, reaching out to underinvested communities, underutilized, marginalized communities. And I think that government should provide those opportunities.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Davis. Next, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mayor Brown, I want to ask you about two issues that are part of the president's jobs plan. One is $100 billion to states and localities to build out high-speed broadband, and the other is water infrastructure. As you know, our city, an old northeastern city, has a lot of old infrastructure. And while these numbers for both broadband, $100 billion and $111 billion to help us replace old lead lines, sometimes the federal government doesn't give local governments, cities in this case, the kind of flexibility that they need in order to meet the objectives. And I would just say, before I give the mayor an opportunity to respond, the mayor started an effort in Buffalo right before the pandemic to replace old lead lines called roll. But obviously, the city and its bonding capacity has limited capacity to replace everything. So this could be a real inflection point for the city of Buffalo as it relates to both high-speed broadband and water infrastructure. So, Mayor, can you share with us your views and recommendations as it relates to flexibility?
Thank you very much, Congressman Higgins, and thank you for your friendship and your diligent and very impactful work in Buffalo, Western New York, and our nation, particularly around some of these issues. When we talk about broadband, we only need to look at the experience of Buffalo during the pandemic, when we went to remote learning in the Buffalo public schools, and there were thousands of children in our school district that did not have access to the internet. We had to partner with the private sector, and we partnered with the Buffalo Bills Social Justice Fund. So we were able to get Spectrum cable to reduce the cost of internet service. And we were able to partner with players from the Buffalo Bills ownership and coaches that came up with $500,000 to help us provide internet to underserved children in the Buffalo public schools. But classic example that government couldn't do it on its own. We needed help from the private sector, and clearly makes the case for resources needed from the federal government to address the digital divides and lack of broadband access for children, not only in Buffalo, but all across the country. We've also talked a lot during this hearing about water lines, lead water lines. Water lines carry the drinking water from the city's main to residents' homes. And when these lines are compromised, either as a result of a break or a leak, they need to be replaced. And when lines are only repaired, lead particles are distributed and can enter a home's drinking water. We came up with Roll, Replace Old Lead Lines in Buffalo because we knew this was a problem. We started the program in 2020, as you mentioned. To date, we've replaced hundreds of old lead lines, old water lead lines, at a cost of over $3 million. But we estimate that there are nearly 40,000 lead service lines throughout Buffalo alone. And the cost of replacing all of those lines is somewhere in the neighborhood of $350 million to $500 million. So this is an issue not just in Buffalo, as we've heard from others that have testified. This is an issue all across our nation. So one of the reasons why I so strongly support President Biden's American Jobs Plan. Thank all of you for your interest in supporting the plan. And I think it's critically important that Congress act to provide these needed resources to our communities.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Mayor. Congressman Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses today. I always learn so much in these hearings, and I appreciate everybody's perspective. My focus in Congress is on jobs, and American competitiveness, and that's what I work on every single day. And we had made tremendous progress with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act by making our tax system competitive in the world. Our regulatory environment, for example, responsible development of our energy resources, with cutting the size of government instead of growing the size of government, with a rebalance on the trade policy of the United States, and it was working. I mean, only a year ago, it seems like a lot longer than that, but only a year ago, we had sub 4% unemployment and record lows in unemployment for almost every demographic, for women and African Americans and for Hispanics. Everybody was doing much better because we undertook a strategy to make the country competitive. Now, next up was infrastructure. I'm all for infrastructure, but what I don't want to do is I don't want to put a title on a bill that says infrastructure when in fact it's not going to, only 10% of the money that's going to be spent in the bill is actually on infrastructure, and the rest is a massive growth of entitlement spending, just like we did with the recent coronavirus relief bill. We called it a coronavirus relief bill, but actually 10% of the money was for coronavirus relief, and most of the rest of it was for massive expansion of entitlement spending. We are paying people to stay home instead of going back to work, and it is delaying our recovery, and it is delaying opportunity for American workers. It makes them reliant on the government, and it stifles our economic growth. And you would think that having just been through 8 years of the Obama Biden administration, that the president would have learned that, because he came in a time of a crisis, and instead of cutting taxes and trying to make the country competitive, they grew government, they raised taxes, and the result was a long, drawn-out, stagnant recovery, at which the end of 8 years, we had dropped from 10% unemployment down to 5% unemployment. In 1 year, 13, 14 months now, we've dropped, with the pro-growth policies of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and other things put in place by Republican Congresses and President Trump, we've dropped from 15% unemployment down to 6% national unemployment and 5% in South Carolina. I mean, the difference in the recovery is astounding. And I want to do an infrastructure plan. I think we can't have a competitive economy if we don't have world-class infrastructure. But what I don't want to do again is try to put lipstick on a pig and to call a bill an infrastructure plan and simply grow government, raise taxes, which would go back, which would reverse the very things that were so successful that led to record unemployment, record growth in wages, record growth in record drop in unemployment for every demographic group. Why would we reverse that and go back to the very things that stifled the economy for 8 years before? So I'm very interested in doing infrastructure. I think we have to do it. And what I don't want to do is make ourselves a little more competitive in that area, while at the same time making us less competitive in other areas. I do have a question for Mr. Cordario. Mr. Cordario, the Charleston Port is not in my district. And I have some of the poorest areas in South Carolina in my district, 3 counties that are majority African American, and 30% of the people live in poverty. And we put a rail laydown yard right in the middle of those 3 counties. It's called the Charleston Inland Port. It's right where 95 comes into South Carolina from the north. And trucks, instead of driving through South Carolina and tearing up the roads and polluting and creating traffic, they can pull off there right where 95 comes into South Carolina, offload at the Dillon Inland Port. And it's been a massive success. Created 2,000 jobs in the first 2 years. That's an example of successful infrastructure. I want to know, is California doing the same kind of thing?
Yes, Congressman. I think when I mentioned emphasis on priorities on infrastructure, the number one on the list was rail, for the reason you just stated. I think ports throughout the nation desperately need rail connectivity, whether it's within the harbor and that connectivity to the marine highway, and of course, very, very important to our American exporters, particularly in the Midwest. So there is an emphasis on rail. However, whether it's at the state or whether it's at the federal level, I think my point here that I would like to leave the committee is the more infrastructure spending, particularly on rail, in the harbor, in the ports, and that rail connectivity of which you mentioned. I think for us here in the West Coast, the inland rail project connectivity is of paramount importance. And with that, again, given the expense that goes behind that, we're appealing that the federal government pays a little bit more attention with regard to rail connectivity overall at our nation's ports. And you mentioned a very good reason. I think the environmental footprint with regard to those corridors certainly is a lot friendlier with regard to having trucks on the highways, particularly that a lot of these corridors are communities of color.
The time has expired. We'd ask folks not to ask their questions in the last 10 seconds, because I do want to make sure.
You figured me out. You figured me out.
Oh, never. I'm sure it was just coincidental, but I hope going forward that we are respectful for the other colleagues who haven't had a chance yet. And speaking of colleagues who haven't had a chance yet, Dan Kildee, it seems like you've been spotlighted throughout this hearing.
I've been busy. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as you know, I talk a lot about my hometown of Flint. I'm going to do a little bit more of that right now because I care about my home community, which has been through awful hard times that precede the water crisis. But during that crisis, this city of 100,000 people were exposed to dangerous levels of lead. And as Dr. Mona has said, lead is a deadly, dangerous neurotoxin. It affects brain development. It has lifelong impacts in children. And when residents started complaining about the quality of water, the state officials at that point in time told them quite literally, this is a quote, just relax. So it was because of the research that Dr. Mona did, looking into the blood levels, lead blood levels in children, that the state was finally forced to reverse course and start to act. But as many of my colleagues know, and I know I've talked to Congresswoman Moore about this. Flint is not some sort of an anomaly. It's a wake-up call for the rest of America. Because as Mayor Brown said, lead service lines in Buffalo, I know in Milwaukee, in Newark, you name it, all these older industrial cities have this problem. And so when I hear some of our colleagues say that they don't believe that replacing lead lines fits the definition of infrastructure, I just tell them to come to Flint, come to talk to my constituents who really still don't even trust the water because they were lied to by their own government about the quality of that water. So in President Biden's American Jobs Plan, he has a transformational plan to rebuild bridges and roads and replacing every lead pipe in America. That's what we have to do. So I want to turn again to Dr. Mona and just talk to us a little bit about how investing in this sort of infrastructure, removing lead lines, makes us more competitive. I mean, and I'll just give one anecdote. It cost us about $120 million to replace all the lead lines in Flint, but the cost of the failure in Flint is right around $1 billion right now when you look at even the proposed civil settlement. So, Dr. Mona, could you talk about the other aspects of this that cause us to be uncompetitive, the long-term impact on the productivity of kids, for example, and compare this to how other countries are addressing the issue?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. You know, when we finally restricted the use of lead in paint, you know, we also didn't eliminate it. It's still underneath those layers of paint. It was said that we were able to raise the IQ of the nation when we finally stopped using lead in paint. And the same will be said when we finally get rid of the pipes that are literally, once again, the straws that deliver our drinking water. You know, there's been so many wonderful ripple effects of the Flint water crisis. We have been able to shine a spotlight on this issue all over. The story of Flint is not an isolated story. It is a story that continues throughout this nation. Too many people, too many children, predominantly disproportionately vulnerable children, are drinking their water once again through these straws. And the science is clear. There's no safe level, and that's where it decreases our competitiveness as a nation. It literally drops IQ levels. It impacts behavior, causes developmental problems, attention problems, focusing problems, growth problems, hearing problems. Kids exposed to lead as adults get things like high blood pressure and early dementia. These are life-altering consequences from drinking something you can't see, you can't taste, you can't smell. That is literally ubiquitous in our drinking water infrastructure. So we will make our nation smarter and stronger and healthier and more competitive in this global economy, because we need every single IQ point to compete in our nation. When we finally, you know, rid our nation of this public health scourge. We never should have put leads in our plumbing. We've known about lead pipes for centuries. The Romans used it, and there's theories that hypothesize the demise of the Romans is because they built their aqueducts on lead pipes. So we've known that lead was bad for a really long time. Yet unfortunately, we've failed to act. We've lacked the political will to do this hard work, but this work that once again makes sense for our kids, but also really makes solid economic sense and global competitiveness sense.
Thank you, Dr. Mona. And I'm old enough to remember a TV commercial that went something like this: you can pay me now or you can pay me later. And I think when it comes to this issue, we are going to pay an enormously painful price if we don't fix this problem now. And it's not just going to come in the form of dollars and cents that we will lose. The loss of possibility for kids is impossible to put a number on. And so I thank you for your testimony. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing me to participate and to have Dr. Mona be a part of this. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Dan. Congressman LaHood.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to acknowledge all of the witnesses for their vital testimony today, and great to be a part of this hearing. I want to follow up a little bit on Congressman Kine's comments about the Mississippi River and the importance of the inland waterway system as it relates to our growth in trade. My district that I represent is the 8th largest in the country in terms of corn and soybean production.
And I remind folks that the number one industry in the state of Illinois is agriculture and agribusiness. And I think about the amount of product that gets put on barges in my district and goes down either the Illinois River or the Mississippi River to New Orleans, gets offloaded and goes all around the world. And, you know, it's interesting that America makes up 4.5% of the world's population. And so it's vital that we have customers and markets around the world to ship our products. And when I think about agriculture and the amount of product that goes down both the Illinois and the Mississippi River, it's important that we invest in our locks and dams and the NES system there. My question is for Mr. Anderson, and I'll just highlight a little bit more on the inland waterway system. In 2020, the Mississippi River locking system moved more than 40 million tons or $10 billion in product of U.S. corn, soybeans, and wheat to export markets. Compared to other modes, shipping via the inland waterway system saves $7 to $9 billion annually. This is in part because barge transportation provides the lowest cost method for shipping bulk commodities over long distances, from interior states where production occurs to coastal export destinations. However, in recent decades, as we've heard on this call today, in this hearing today, we've seen how red tape is holding back the export capacity of the United States' agriculture footprint. For example, NEST, which is the Navigational and Ecosystem Sustainability Program, was authorized in 2007 by the Congress to construct 7 1,200-foot locks, but they still await appropriation to begin the construction. Even after bipartisan multi-state support as one of the largest support from across, as one of the largest soybean exporters in the U.S., Illinois has led the country 4 of the last 5 years with soybean production. We continue to look at how do we expand these locks along the Mississippi River to the 1,200-foot locks from the current 600 lock chambers. This would provide shippers with additional capacity to handle the projected rise in volume of commodity grain shipments. According to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers' latest estimate, the cost to construct these 7 locks will be approximately $4.2 billion. However, U.S. agriculture exports are projected to continue increasing over the next decade. With this growth, maintaining reliable, efficient, and modern infrastructure on our inland waterways becomes crucial to keeping a competitive advantage in our export markets. With that, Mr. Anderson, as we look at how do we coordinate with our inland waterways system with landlocked states like Illinois, I was wondering if you could discuss the challenges you've experienced, whether that's with the delay of goods to the port or limited barge capacity issues due to inadequate water infrastructure on our inland waterways. And again, how does this harm our competitive advantage as the U.S. Looks at expanding our agricultural footprint around the world?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. As you mentioned, our inland waterways, locks, and dams are critical and vital components of our nation's infrastructure and our ability to transport agricultural goods and particularly for export. For example, even here at our port, one of our largest export commodities is fertilizer, and it also utilizes the inland locks to go into the breadbasket, including of the United States, your state, to farmers. You mentioned the Army Corps of Engineers. One of the big delays in many of these projects is overburdensome regulatory compliance with the Army Corps. About 4 years ago, the Army Corps came out with a 333 guidance for their projects, and I think it's really important for the competitive delivery of projects in the United States. We need to maintain those 3.3 guidance at the U.S. Army Corps and sort of hold the Corps accountable to that. I know not necessarily that this committee has oversight of that, but it certainly would be helpful in the delivery of projects. And the cost of those projects with every year of delay goes up significantly. So you mentioned the $4.1 billion. Those projects will double in 5 or 6 years if they're not funded and delivered. And our country needs inland waterway infrastructure to interconnect with the rest of the international waterways so we can be competitive with the rest of the world.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Congressman Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing, this opportunity to be able to hear from so many experts in something that is so needed, especially when it comes to infrastructure and when it comes to infrastructure for our trade. The first thing I'd like to do, Mr. Chairman, is I'd like to submit for the record a letter from the American Association of Port Authorities in support of the American Jobs Plan, if that's okay.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank my colleague and my good friend, Mr. LaHood, for that lead up to my questioning, because I absolutely agree with everything that Mr. LaHood said there. However, although agriculture may be king in Illinois, California, where I'm from, is the king of agriculture, especially when in the United States. With all due respect to Mr. LaHood. But also part of that reason is because of my district right here on the Central Coast, which everybody knows, at least there in Congress, considering my advocacy of it, is the salad bowl of the world. And infrastructure is very integral, obviously, to what we do here in the international and domestic commerce that allows us to have that title. I mean, it facilitates getting goods to market, ensuring that we can all benefit from an increased trade. I mean, it really is what makes the Central Coast the salad bowl of the world and not just the salad bowl of the Central Coast. However, I think as we're hearing today, and as we know well, our infrastructure is facing increased challenges, from the Suez Canal to the slowdowns at our ports to the lack of available shipping vessels. It really can leave growers and producers in my district with nowhere to go if it's dilapidated. And of course, climate change is presenting many challenges to the resiliency of such infrastructure. It's especially true for ports, as we've heard from our witnesses, which are facing increased storms and rising sea levels and increased blackouts and power shutoffs. And we also must take seriously, though, our grid resiliency and encourage the building of clean energy microgrids like what's at the Port of Long Beach and their microgrid projects. Microgrids can help us keep the lights on, not just at our ports, but also in our homes and in our communities. And I believe that now is a time that we do have an opportunity to make a bold investment in our infrastructure. As the president said last night, I quote, "Doing nothing is not an option. We can't be so busy competing with each other that we forget the competition is with the rest of the world to win the 21st century." Now, we in California, as some of our witnesses know, we're facing increased risk from wildfire and blackouts and intentional public safety power shutoffs. So, Mr. Cordario, being that you're from the Port of Long Beach, I know you mentioned and understand the importance of isolating the grid. And I've introduced legislation, the Microgrid Act, to provide tax credits for qualified microgrid property to encourage the deployment of clean energy microgrids. It also includes a direct pay option for governments and nonprofits who ordinarily are locked out of such tax credits. So again, Mr. Cordario, how do microgrids factor into the Port of Long Beach's energy and climate resilience strategy? And how can they help you reduce your emissions?
Well, first of all, Congressman, thank you so much. As you've mentioned, the Port of Long Beach, we are environmental stewards in these areas. We do have an energy initiative policy here, a plan of action. And the first thing I'd like to say, that it is projected that in the next decade, as we move forward to more dependency on the grid, we're going to increase our dependency on that grid 4 to 6 times. So I think one of the things that we need to do is move forward with renewable energy, microgrid projects, because as you've mentioned, it is paramount for us to move forward with system resiliency and long-term cost stability. And for that reason, President Biden has proposed an investment of about $8 billion to the grid. And I think that is paramount for whether it's California or any other state here in the United States. And I think one thing you've mentioned about California, this whole issue of resiliency also relates to the whole issue of infrastructure, for the reason that, again, as we move forward to electrify our systems here, it reduces emissions. I think Long Beach has proven that in the last decade, we've reduced particulate matter by 88%. NOx by 59%, SOx by 97%. And our goal is to move towards zero emission. So I think, again, it's paramount as we move forward to whether it's EV cars, EV trucks, and the whole issue of energy dependency in the grid. It is absolutely important. And the last thing I'll say about the farm issue, you're right, California is a leader in ag products. 26% are export products that depend on foreign markets. And going forward, the demand for ag is actually more going to be in the exterior, that is outside the United States, as opposed to the interior. And for that reason, the AAPA, who consists of 130 port members, include both coastal ports and inland ports. And we strongly support investment also to the Marine Highway Program as part of the DOT purview.
Thank you, Mr. Cordario. I'm out of time, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today. I find it kind of odd that we're having a hearing that's supposed to be on trade infrastructure when the majority's let so many trade tools such as GSP and MTB expire, and about to let one of our most important tools, TPA, which during the previous administration we'd recognized as a driving force behind expanding our export markets. I've said numerous times, and it bears repeating, trade's vital to the Kansas economy. South Central Kansas, not only the air capital of the world, but it's also home to many of our state's leading farmers, ranchers, manufacturers, and small businesses. Kansas exports more than $4 billion in agricultural products across the globe, from Canada to Japan and everywhere in between. Getting trade right has major implications for the families and workers I represent. For example, President Trump's USMCA trade deal has directly increased Kansans' opportunities to trade with Canada and Mexico. As two of the largest export markets for American agricultural products, the USMCA success story will benefit South Central Kansas for many years to come. If given good policy from Washington, Kansas can outcompete anyone against the world. Unfortunately, all too often, the policies that come out of Washington don't do us any good. The $2.3 trillion so-called infrastructure plan is a prime example of that. With a broad definition of infrastructure, I could call my water bottle here essential infrastructure. The plan that stints with tax hikes and Green New Deal regulations will crush American manufacturers and small businesses. It's really a Trojan horse for a lot of socialist policies, because only 5% of it's going to roads and bridges and smaller percentages to other types of infrastructure. Instead of focusing on building actual infrastructure that's needed to facilitate international trade and boost our economic growth, this plan focuses on that liberal wish list, including electric vehicles, tax increases on all Americans, and additional bailouts to unions. Kansas and my district and across the state don't want trillions of dollars in job-killing regulations and tax increases from Washington. They want to get the goods to market in order to provide their uniquely superior product around the world. In the not too distant past, the need for improved infrastructure was something that both parties agreed on. But today, the Democrat majority seems to be more concerned with pushing radical policies that benefit a few at the expense of hardworking families. I'm additionally concerned that the proposals to make our oil and gas producers uncompetitive in the global marketplace. Over the last 4 years, we as a nation were able to neutralize the price controls and collusion of OPEC, and we're starting down the road of energy independence. Penalizing American companies and preventing them from competing in the global marketplace will wreak havoc on our trade infrastructure. As we recover from the global pandemic, it's more important than ever that we help American manufacturers, farmers, and energy producers compete internationally. But instead of helping get our economy back to full speed, this bill has been enacted will increase countless roadblocks to growth, like higher taxes, more regulation, and an all-out assault on our energy producers. I believe we must focus on finding real solutions to help improve our infrastructure and encourage exports without tax hikes that limit economic growth. We should build off the incredible economic gains that we saw under the Trump administration by keeping our taxes competitive and reducing unnecessary regulations. These were keys to helping America create the booming economy we saw before the pandemic and which helps so many families with job opportunities and better paychecks. I'd like to turn to Mr. Anderson for a question. Over the last decade, as the United States has become dominant in global energy market, we have seen U.S. energy exports skyrocket. Mr. Anderson, could you speak on the role the Port Tampa Bay has played in Florida's energy sector, and what sorts of investments can we make to further facilitate this impressive growth and make energy trade as efficient as possible?
Thank you, Congressman. As I mentioned in my statement to the committee, Port Tampa Bay provides, is an energy gateway, provides about half of the energy that is consumed and utilized in the state of Florida. So that's 22 million residents and 130 million visitors to the state of Florida pre-pandemic, which we expect to come back. Our energy infrastructure is critical, not just during normal times, but certainly was critical during the pandemic, even though we saw a significant reduction. But it is also extremely important for those of us in the Gulf of Mexico, all of my colleagues in the port, when a hurricane enters into the Gulf, and the resiliency of that infrastructure. And we've worked really hard to protect that infrastructure and be able to recover in the event of a storm, to supply the citizens the fuel that they need for not just getting back to work, but for air conditioning, for buses, for grocery trucks, whatever the needs are. And we're going to continue to do that at the port and all of our ports. And I would just echo the comments by my colleague, Mr. Cordario. The need for investment in America's ports is critical. Give it to the men and women that work in our ports, and we'll give you a return on investment. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Anderson. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And I do look forward to having this conversation, because what we've heard from our witnesses here today, what my Republican colleagues did in terms of cutting taxes and assaulting environmental protections didn't meet the needs of ports, didn't meet the needs of broadband, didn't meet the needs for children who are being poisoned by lead pipes. So I think we'll have a robust conversation in the committee about these dual approaches and hearing from people who are wrestling with the infrastructure deficits. I would like to turn at this point to Congresswoman Galbeni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for holding this important hearing. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted many of the existing inequities in our country, and one of those inequities is access to affordable, reliable broadband, as many people have raised. During the pandemic, we've relied on access to the internet for everything from meeting with our doctors to virtual classrooms. And the FCC estimates that 97% of Americans living in urban areas have access to high-speed broadband. But that number drops sharply to 65% for Americans living in rural areas and 60% for those living on tribal lands. And according to the GAO, we know that the FCC overstates the availability of internet broadband service on tribal lands. So the true numbers are even worse because we haven't even talked about affordability in those numbers. I know the chairman also was talking about the need for broadband on tribal lands. President Sharp, can you speak to the impact of this lack of access to affordable broadband and the lack of access, the impact it has on tribal communities?
Yes, certainly. And thank you, Representative, for your leadership in being such a champion for tribal nations in Congress. We truly appreciate your leadership. There's no question that the digital divide has impacted our ability to sustain our economies and is currently directly impacting our education and the welfare of our communities during this pandemic. And we recognize that part of the challenge for Indian country is the funding to build, develop, deploy broadband is dispersed over a number of various funding agencies, departments, et cetera. And so from our perspective, to directly confront this issue, I think we need to comprehensively and strategically develop the investment through all stages of broadband deployment we do recognize this is critical infrastructure, and tribal communities must have direct access to the spectrum over their lands, and include that we do have these targeted investments in all facets, whether on the reservation or off the reservation. It is so critically important, and this pandemic has made it very clear that the disproportionate impacts, and broadband is that critical infrastructure that is going to help us meet the challenges of COVID-19 and emerge stronger and more resilient.
Thank you. You know, President Biden has proposed investing $100 billion to connect every American to affordable high-speed internet. To your point, how can we in Congress be deliberate in ensuring that federal infrastructure investments are going to tribal broadband projects?
Yes, as I mentioned, part of the challenge that we have is when we try to strategically address broadband, there are various phases. And so there are phases for development, there are phases for planning. And these various phases are not aligned with the funding availability in various departments. And so it would be very helpful for us if there was a strategic look at how grants and opportunities, other policies are made available to tribal nations to access the full, every one of the phases in a very strategic way, because right now it is hit and miss. The windows vary, and we just cannot align our planning efforts with the availability of resources and opportunities.
And thank you for that. In relation to broadband, do you see a connection between the investment in that sector and addressing climate change?
Yes, absolutely. There's no question that broadband can help us transition into a world, a low carbon economy globally, and creating jobs for our nations, and not only within our reservation, but certainly the surrounding communities. And if nothing has really proven during this pandemic, we're able to work remotely. Tribal nations are also directly engaged in international trade and commerce. And so having an ability to be able to access communication channels at all levels on the reservation and with our partners here nationally as well as internationally would be very helpful as we address the impacts of climate change.
Thank you. And again, President Sharp, thank you so much for joining us. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very, very much, Congressman Delbene. Ambassador Beyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, Earl, thank you so much for all you do to lead us on trade and infrastructure. And thank you to our many guests. I have been, we listened to a lot of speeches this afternoon. I just like to make one small amendment. I wish we would stop talking about infrastructure. The president's speech last night talked about the American Jobs Plan, and he talked about the American Family Plan. And if we could just get rid of this fake debate about the dictionary word of the meaning of infrastructure and think about investment, then this is exactly what we're talking about, is investing in America's future, investing in our economy, investing in our human capital, investing in the things that will give us the kind of rapid growth rate that we all desire. Dr. Hannah Atisha Mona, the president last night talked about 10 million homes with lead pipes, 400,000 schools and child care centers with lead pipes, and he pledged to have 100% of the pipes replaced as part of this plan. Is this doable? Can we find those pipes? How do we make that real?
Oh, thank you for that question. So yeah, the first part is finding the pipes, and there is no accurate count. There has never been a requirement to actually create an inventory of lead pipes. So that's going to be the first task, is to find them. And both Flint and Newark have been really creative in how they've gone about finding them. And they've done it fairly quickly. But there is, based on surveys, an estimate of about 6.5 to 10 million lead pipes. They're mainly concentrated in the Midwest and the Northeast. The majority of lead, or the city with the most number of lead pipes is actually Chicago. They were still putting them in 1986. It was a requirement. You had to use the lead pipe up until 1986, but they're fairly ubiquitous. So yes, we have to find them. And something that Flint and Newark has proven is we can do this work quickly. The only two cities that have replaced their lead pipes before Flint and Newark were Madison, Wisconsin, and Lansing, Michigan. And it took them about a decade. And both Flint and Newark have done this in much faster time and have been able to train up a workforce. And, the plumbers, the pipe fitters, folks are ready to work. And in many of these communities, they are communities that have higher rates of unemployment and underemployment, where families don't have those living wage jobs that they need to support themselves and especially their children. So we already have good examples of how it's been done and how it can be done. We just need to put the dollars behind it.
Great. Thank you very much. That's very encouraging. Dr. Turner Lee, in the Obama administration, there was a major effort to get broadband out to a lot of the underserved areas. And I'm thinking rural America specifically, and even rural Virginia specifically. And one of the pushbacks they got was they were connecting the homes that the people in the homes weren't using them, but there was an adoption problem. How do we, and obviously, when you can't go to school, that helps with the adoption, right? You have no choice. But how do we match up this expansion of broadband with also an expansion of its actual utilization so they get the benefits?
No, thank you for that. And you're my congressman, by the way, here in Virginia. So thank you for calling on me. I think it goes back to giving equal weight to both the deployment as well as the adoption and use buckets. And I think right now we have to level those investments so we're able to do both. To your point, in my visits during my book to Stanton, Virginia, and places like Roanoke, we're seeing exactly what you're talking about. We're just across, either patchy broadband access or just not enough for kids to be able to get online, and actually Main Street businesses to be participating in this new economy and create these new forms of trade. So I do think as we look at this, we have to look at the Clyburn-Klobuchar Act in terms of equity investments modeled after Congressman Davis's Digital Equity Act. We have to look at ways to unleash the capacities of school districts to sort of put in what they think they might need to be able to connect their students to these use cases, and even community healthcare clinics. Congressman, I would say solving the adoption problem is going to be one part investment, but the other part of it is going to be collaboration and cooperation among the use cases most affected during the pandemic that now have a sense of what's going to be needed to get their folks connected.
Great. Thank you, Doctor, very much. And Mr. Chairman, with respect to the 25 seconds left, I yield back.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Mr. Arrington appears to have disappeared from my screen. So
Can you see me?
Jody, are you with us?
There I go. Can you see me and hear?
Okay.
Thank you, Chairman. Having technical difficulties on my side here, so thanks for your patience. And I appreciate the witnesses. Here's the thing. We all, Republicans and Democrats, understand the importance of infrastructure, and we all want to make the necessary and appropriate investments. I think we could also probably come to some common definition of what is infrastructure, but I think therein lies a big sticking point for us to move forward as a country and in a bipartisan way. I think when you talk about the technology infrastructure, you talk about energy infrastructure, transportation, obviously. I think those are core to what the investments we need to make. But we have to be very targeted and very judicious in prioritizing anything that costs money these days at $30 trillion in debt and counting. And so, but the problem is my colleagues, I know who are well-intentioned in many ways and want to do infrastructure like I do and Republicans, but to go beyond the infrastructure as traditionally defined and as we've discussed in some part, to go into Medicaid and housing assistance and $100 billion for schools and additional funding there, Department of Commerce, $50 billion, climate science, $35 billion, $10 billion for a new civilian climate corps. Those are non-starters. We're never going to get down the road to any meaningful investment in infrastructure that way. So I assume when you're talking about, as the port authorities, especially on the call, when you talk about capital investment, that's a significant investment. And you all, unlike the government, where we can borrow and go into debt upwards of 100% of our output of our total economy, you have to make trade-offs. You have to make decisions about where you're going to put the money to give the greatest return for your stakeholders. Can you tell me, Mr. Anderson, that process, just to help guide us? What are the metrics that guide your capital investments that might be a good framework for us about building out and modernizing America's infrastructure? Just an example.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Bottom line is our ports, our nation's ports, are economic developers, and we're focused on job creation and returning contributions to local, state, and federal taxes by our investments. And we match our dollars with federal and state dollars to develop infrastructure that serves the public and to bring, hopefully good jobs to our communities. Your Texas ports and all of our ports around the country are very, very good at investing the dollars that the federal government gives to us to get return on investment in these areas. And
Mr.
Yes.
If I might ask, with the Medicaid expansion of $400 billion as part of the proposal, which is 4 times the amount for roads and bridges, and the list that I gave earlier, and then the tax that's being proposed, the tax hike to pay for it, and which is going to make us less competitive and push jobs and companies to re-domicile, as we saw prior to the tax cuts overseas. Is that a concern in terms of focusing on infrastructure, targeting, prioritizing, so that we don't have to lose that competitive edge, the cost, pass everybody, ports, consumers, and again, hurting our ability to compete and produce and push out more product to the globe?
Well, yeah, Congressman, our American Association of Port Authorities, we submitted a letter for the record earlier in the hearing, which outlines our positions on this and where we need those investments. And how this bill or whatever bill is passed, I'll leave that to the members of the committee and members of Congress. We are going to try and give you guidance on what our industry needs to be competitive with the world, and we're getting outcompeted by our competitors, particularly in Asia. And every dollar that it gets appropriated through whatever bill it is, we're going to the ports. We're gonna invest that in America's future.
But it really isn't going to help to have a higher tax rate than communist China and other competitors. And I think that's the balance we've got to strike. We've got to be focused on what will give us the greatest return and growth and jobs, and work on I don't know how much time I have, Chairman. I don't want to go over. Do I have a minute left?
Your time has expired.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, no, thank you. Ms. Sanchez, are you still with us? Mr. Boyle, you've disappeared. Ms. Miller?
Here I am. Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer and Ranking Member Buchanan, and thank you to all of our witnesses here today. I think all of my colleagues can agree that our nation needs serious investment in our infrastructure. World-class infrastructure is the backbone of international trade. It not only allows for our goods and services to move efficiently within our own borders, but facilitates our goods and services getting out into the global economy. It is the cornerstone in creating good-paying jobs and growing our economy. As we saw in January, the administration's attack on the Keystone Pipeline not only cost thousands of jobs, but it also cut off a key link in our nation's energy infrastructure. Thanks to advancements in drilling technology, America has gained energy independence as a net exporter while also reducing our emissions. We have an opportunity to share our abundant natural resources with the world, but we need proper infrastructure in place to do so. Take our allies in Europe, for example. They import Russian gas, which, according to the Department of Energy's Natural Energy Laboratories, it has a 40% higher life cycle emission profile than American natural gas transported to the same location. If we could get proper energy infrastructure here in the United States, we could not only export natural gas to our allies, but help lower global emissions. Natural gas has the ability to help developing nations come online. We need significantly more investment in efficient pipelines and LNG export terminals in America so we can help nations around the world keep their homes, businesses, and schools powered, all the while reducing emissions. Mr. Anderson, what kind of infrastructure is needed at a port to ensure that all types of energy can reach the port and get out to sea?
Energy transmission investment through LNG connectivity pipelines. Currently, there are several ports in the United States that are fueling stations for ships as they convert to liquid natural gas. And it's really important that we have competitive investment into both carbon production of fuels, but also, as we've noted in the American Association of Port Authorities letter submitted today, to wind investment as well offshore. So our ports need investment in whatever kind of power our country is going to be needing today and for the future, so that we can be the gateway for American citizens. And infrastructure of transmission of fuel, electricity, whatever the case may be, needs continued investment. And at the ports, we are the gateways for those energy products.
Well, tell me, are there regulatory hurdles that impact this infrastructure?
Well, sure. There's, compliance with all sorts of, that's not an area that I, get into the actual transmission. Those are private partners that typically do that, as we're a landlord port that has hundreds of tenants, and they make those investments. But anytime we can find a way to competitively streamline the ability to deliver projects in our country, allows us to be more competitive in the global marketplace.
Can you recommend any way Congress can better facilitate energy through our ports?
Well, I would say yes. As I stated earlier, my comment, Congresswoman, is to find equitable investment in energy transmission facilities. Some of those include, whatever type of energy it is, tax incentives, which your committee has purview over for investing in both, carbon traditional energy or alternative energy sources.
Well, beyond energy, what have time?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. All right, I'll just ask my question. What's your general port?
Carol, it's not through. Maybe we can circle him. You're breaking up on us. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Congresswoman Moore.
Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to wave on to this subcommittee hearing. This is so vitally important, and I think that
you are always welcome, Gwen. Always welcome.
Thank you. And we have heard so much discussion about, whether or not this is too big of an investment or the right type of investment, what's infrastructure, not infrastructure, that this is a lifetime investment, a generational investment. I certainly heard Mr. Kildee use the F word, drop the F-bomb already. So that I have some of the same circumstances in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But the real issue that I have, and maybe I start out with Mayor Brown and maybe Ms. Dr. Turner as well. What I worry about is that we're going to pass this huge bill and get this money out, and that there will be no way to make it equitable. You take like Keystone Pipeline, for example. Yes, this job lost, but there are millions, thousands of jobs that will be available to replace these pipes. And these are the same workers they have a lot more work to do. But what I'm concerned about is that while we try to make sure that we have labor organization agreements and so on, what Mayor Brown would you say is the most important thing that we do legislative to make sure that we get the and we don't just make this huge expenditure and it goes to the same old contractors? Mayor Brown?
I think he may be off the call now. I'm sorry.
Oh, is he? Well, I would ask Dr. Turner that question.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. And I also applaud and want to say I'm a huge fan of yours as well. So thank you for asking me that question. Listen, I mean, I think that what we're having a conversation about when we talk about infrastructure, what has changed in the pandemic is not just the fact that we already knew prior to this public health crisis that we had eroding infrastructure in our water, our transport, our energy and electric systems, but we've also discovered the critical asset of broadband, along with the complementary infrastructure that needs to be devoted in terms of resources, because the equity switch became uneven. When we think about complementary infrastructure, for example, for school-age children, it wasn't just having broadband at home, but they didn't have devices. They didn't have hotspots. They didn't have what we would actually consider to be 21st century books in the K through 12 public schools among 15 to 16 million students who are going to be the workers of the future. And so it's important for us to think about the way that our society is moving, Congressman, like you said. And we have to also recognize that these new opportunities, just like agriculture and just like manufacturing from the past, are actually going to be ways to create, like you said, the new jobs of the 21st century. You need people to not only realize that we're using these new tools. Think about the way that we receive our groceries, the way we talk to our friends, the way we're doing this hearing. These are now the new normal of what infrastructure is going to look like, and people need the tools to engage that. They need the workforce training skills, and we need the contracts that are going to show equitable distribution so that everybody is put back to work. But we're also balancing now some of the inconsistencies that we've had historically when it comes to getting everybody on board to make this country great again. And so I think, to your point, it's got to be an even keel approach that looks at critical physical infrastructure, complementary infrastructure, which is those tools that people need to engage in, as well as the workforce development school tools and the investments in human supports so that people can stay engaged as we move forward and out of this pandemic.
Well, would you agree that it makes something like in the city of Milwaukee, we have 770 years of pipes to be replaced at the pace we're going now. So would you agree that one of the real important principles is to be patient and not insist that this, the shovel ready projects, that we not just put this money out with some desperate effort for, to show that we're doing the right thing, but be patient so we can stand up those job training programs to do it.
Yes,
And that's got to be part of it.
Yes, I totally agree. I think we have this opportunity with this down payment to now be very careful about how we're credentialing, how we're scaling, and how we're creating the occupational skills so that we can compete with China and other places who are way ahead in their research and development and their investment in people. It's just one of those areas I agree with you. A calculated, calibrated approach is actually going to be the best way that we leverage these investments and the way that we streamline hope back into our economy and into our communities.
Thank you, Congresswoman Moore, for your
My
patience.
time has expired.
We appreciate your patience and your joining us again. I would like to express my deep appreciation for all our witnesses, for the mayor, I guess, is no longer with us, Mr. Cordario and Mr. Anderson, for having the perspective in terms of the port issues. Dr. Turner Lee, the leave no child offline sort of impetus, I think is one of the best takeaway lines for me for this hearing. President Sharp, providing the perspective of our Native American partners, our responsibilities and things we need to do. Mr. Santos giving us some perspective at the ground level about how this actually worked. And Dr. Mona, you were worth waiting for. I tried scribbling down the factoids. It was all of this for me was extraordinarily useful, and I deeply appreciate your participation and the engagement of the subcommittee members. We're going to, at this point, conclude the hearing. We really appreciate the witnesses underscoring the need for significant federal investment. We'll refine some of these issues, but I think they're broad common themes. I'd like to thank the witnesses for your engagement with us and look forward to working with you going forward. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. I don't know if you're on the hook for those or our staff, but we will share with you any questions that the members have for you. These questions and any answers you want to provide will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Have a great afternoon, everyone.